Hello. This is a presentation on the history of Western River allocations in 15 minutes. Yeah, right. Well, we'll do what we can, okay? My name is Tom Martin. I volunteer for a small nonprofit called River Runners for Wilderness. I write river guides with Dwayne Whitus, and I've written a hiking guide for river runners in Grand Canyon and a couple books on river history. River history really interests me now, especially when I look at the Western rivers and their really odd allocations, heavily favored for commercial use with just a small amount of non-commercial use. This presentation is about what I've found about the history of how that happened. This is the Colorado River, and this is where it all started. That red box up there is supposed to represent Dinosaur National Monument. And this red box down below, larger one, is where Grand Canyon National Park is. And these two Park Service units together were responsible for forming this problem we're looking at. If we look at the 2004 Grand Canyon National Park Draft River Management Plan, there's a really nice chart here. When we zoom in on this chart, we see that the commercial use just really took off in 1965 through 1970, while the non-commercial use was barely there, maybe even non-existent, people say. Well, what I've discovered is that the 1930s, 40s, and 50s were instrumental for the implementation of permit controls that denied non-commercial use river permits and river access. Absolutely amazing. Well, let's open this up. When Grand Canyon National Park became a park in 1919, 27 people had boated from Lee's Ferry through the Grand Canyon to Pierce Ferry. This man, Superintendent Minor Tillotson, was Grand Canyon National Park's first long-term superintendent, and he encouraged his rangers to go out and explore the river and the backcountry. And sadly, just a year or so into his tenure as superintendent, 2 of his employees drowned in low water Horn Creek. And this had a serious impact on Tillotson. And he basically, until he died, still as the Southwest Regional Director of the Park Service, he did not want any Park Service employees or anyone else for that matter on the river. There were a bunch of river runners that went through the Grand Canyon during his tenure as superintendent. And I want to mention the Dr. Elzada Clover expedition. This woman was responsible for a river trip that got her through Grand Canyon. She wrote the boatman leading the boats, a fellow named Norm Nevels, to contact the park to see if they needed a permit. And so Norman Nevels on the right did send a letter to Superintendent Tillotson requesting information about a permit. And Tillotson wrote back that a formal permit isn't required, but we naturally do all in our power to discourage such trips. And indeed, there's some more correspondence between the French trio. Bernard de Clermont wrote Superintendent Tillotson about boating through the park, and Tillotson said, I don't want you to do that. If you insist, I will require that you post a $10,000 bond. That's $181,000 in 2021 dollars. And the French trio exited the river at Lee's Ferry. Harry Ailson and Georgie White hiked into the river down Parashant Canyon in 1946, and they blew up their little pack raft and they went down to Lake Mead, and they got some press. And Tillotson, of course, objected to this. So much so that the acting National Park Service Director, Hillary Tolson, notified all national parks of the 2 parties who floated down the Colorado River from Parashant Wash, stating every reasonable effort should be made to discourage hazardous expeditions into service areas. Tillotson left Grand Canyon and became the Southwest Regional Director, overseeing Grand Canyon. And the new superintendent, Harold Bryant, issued the first river permit to Norman Nevels in 1947. Later that same year, Park Service Director Newton Drury wrote, we owe it both to ourselves and to the venturesome to assert such control over these attempts as we can legally, without impeding undertakings such as those conducted by Norman Nevels. This is a watershed letter that allows continued commercial growth while imposing controls over the venturesome. Drury charged Superintendent Bryant with writing a permit application because Bryant was issuing permits, but he didn't have an application for the permit. So Bryant did that. There were 10 questions. And National Park Service Associate Director Demray noted it was designed to eliminate the daredevil expeditions. Eliminate. Bryant offered Nevels a sole source river concession in late 1947 and wrote some of the wild expeditions through the canyon could be partially stopped by strict regulations demanding a permit and requirements as to the equipment and as to experienced personnel. Nevels was all for it. He wanted the concession. And he also wrote that by enacting certain very stringent regulations, you will keep out poorly equipped and inexperienced whitewater men. Norm noted that boatmen should have at least 1,000 miles of boating on fairly rough water, and any form of rubber life raft or boat is not safe. Well, I just want to mention that there was a lot of river running happening in the West at that time. The do-it-yourself people, the non-commercial people were out there in force boating, and it wasn't like they weren't there. I also want to mention that Harry Ilson started running commercial rubber raft trips through Grand Canyon in 1949, and Norm Nevels was livid. That sole source contract as a concessionaire couldn't come fast enough because Ailson was undercutting the prices Norm Nevels was charging by 50%. Sadly, Norm Nevels crashed his private plane and he and his wife died. And Superintendent Bryant was shattered. He wrote, "Here Nevels is dead. And the only person that seems to be in line to run commercial trips is this Harry Ailson. And obviously he's crazy ideas. He's dangerous. So I've decided to stop all boating." That didn't go real well with the other non-commercial boaters, including Otis Marston here on the right, the river historian. The fellow on the left, Bestor Robinson, was a water lawyer, and Marston and Robinson met with Superintendent Bryant a few weeks after he announced the closure of the river, and they talked him into opening the river back up again. But Bryant had his problems. Just a year later, a guy showed up with a little boat called the Deacon's Dilemma, and without a permit, launched the boat at Lee's Ferry, made it to Phantom Ranch, hiked out, and intended to come back some weeks later and continue his trip. But Superintendent Bryant wrote him a scathing letter, basically saying any do-it-yourself trip attempting a river cruise without a permit, regardless of skill, supply, or craft used, would be considered illegal, and every effort would be made to remove this type of illegal trip from the river. It mattered not if the occupants were doing just fine. With so many river trips on the river, Bryant had to admit the river's now a regular highway, and it's hard to take care of everybody. I want to mention that in 1953, a guy named Blaine Stubblefield up in Hell's Canyon put an outboard motor on the back of a bridge pontoon and started doing commercial trips. And this went through the Colorado River boating community like wildfire. I also want to mention that up at Dinosaur National Monument, Dinosaur was having its problems with do-it-yourself river runners as well. By the end of 1953, the Echo Park Dam fight at Dinosaur National Monument was winding down. Everybody could see where it was going. The dam was going to be removed from the monument. But the NPS wanted to respond to charges of lack of public access to the monument by starting a commercial river concession. And they did that by going out and getting some bridge pontoons and giving a concession to a local man named Bus Hatch. Eventually, Hatch would get that concession revoked because he didn't have insurance. But until then, what Superintendent Jess Lombard at Dinosaur National Monument and his boss, Assistant Director of Region 2, John McLaughlin, did was they solved their means of controlling this type of use by not encouraging boating on these rivers without the services of a competent guide. And they put these big signs at all the put-ins to the Monument River section saying, "Warning, river rapids hazardous." proper equipment and experienced guide necessary, permit required. And thus was born that same year the Western River Guides Association, a bunch of guides ready to lead trips through the monument. Those bridge pontoons that Blaine Stubblefield started showed up the next year at Grand Canyon, the first one by oar power, the second one by motor power in 1954. Both trips had no permits. Then these guys came along without a boat at all. They just showed the efficacy of good life jackets as they swam through Grand Canyon without a permit. John McLaughlin was reassigned to become superintendent of Grand Canyon National Park in the winter of 1955-56, and he rewrote the boating permits. They were completely revised. What he did was McLaughlin had the permit ask for dates for experience through Grand Canyon. Unlike in the past, if the applicant could not list experience through Grand Canyon, the application was not approved. And right away, there are hundreds of denial letters for non-commercial river runners being denied permits because they have no prior experience going through Grand Canyon. Didn't matter what other rivers they'd run. And it didn't matter if they were John Wesley Powell or Julius Stone or George Flavel or anybody else. They weren't going to get a permit if they hadn't gone through the park. Now, there was one guy that was trying to approach this with some sort of science, and he was looking at all the injuries that were being reported on the river. His name was Otis Reed Marston, that river historian guy that got the river opened back up again. And Marston wrote the Park Service cautioning about following the dinosaur model because he didn't see the injury data supporting the experience in the boatman as adequate insurance against risk of life. Cautioned about attempting to lay down the law too strictly. And Marston was really sure that the NPS should take a stance of wanting to help river runners. Sadly, the Park Service didn't take his advice to heart. Then they continued in their status quo. Grand Canyon National Park put this sign up on the road to the river: unauthorized boating through Grand Canyon National Park is prohibited. And both the monument and the park in 1958 and 59 brought lawsuits against river runners who boated through these service units without permits. Again, as we mentioned, commercial use exploded between 65 and 70. In 1970, an alarmed National Park Service froze all river use as roughly 10,000 commercial passengers and crew and about 300 do-it-yourself river runners made the trip. From 4 commercial operators in 1956, there were 24 operators in 1970. The park was just giving out permits to any commercial operator who wanted them, unlimited number of permits. So the Bureau of Land Management and the U.S. Forest Service looked to the National Park Service in the 1970s and modeled their river allocations after the Grand Canyon and dinosaur models. It's unclear if they understood the background behind the NPS allocations. I doubt they did. So now you know, when you see this graph, that the permit controls placed on the venturesome here in the 1940s and 50s are responsible for the fact that non-commercial use didn't get a chance to grow at all until 1979, when the park changed their permit requirements. I must tell you, I didn't tell you half of this story, but I'd certainly like to entertain any questions now. Thank you so much.